Hello, this is Steve Campitelli of Academic Skills. Today we're presenting effectively. I've divided this presentation into two parts. The first part deals with the presentation itself and how it's sequenced. The second part deals with the PowerPoint, the visual, and some tips and some strategies, some ideas on how to use that a bit more effectively. Okay, so we'll make a start. This doctor, she's a US professor, Susan Weinschenk. She talks about 5 things that presenters need to know before they present. I'm going to go through those 5 and we'll just talk about them as we go. She talks about dividing information into sequenced chunks. Now, in the same way you view an essay or you view your writing, you divide it into sequenced chunks: an introduction, a conclusion section, and a body section in the middle. And she talks about dividing a longer talk, perhaps one of an hour where you might have a departmental presentation, or a longer conference workshop, into 20-minute chunks. And she talks about shorter talks, 20-minute conference presentations, for example, perhaps in 5-minute chunks. Some great examples of how people present and sequence their information really well. TED Talks, if you go to tedtalks.com and have a look. Another one, if you haven't checked it out, is fantastic. It's a 3-minute thesis, 3MT. If you Google or YouTube 3MT, you can find some great examples online. And what happens in the 3MT is people doing a PhD have compressed their thesis into 3 minutes as an oral presentation. It's a fantastic example of reduction and sequencing. She also talks about being aware of multiple sensory channels. Now, there are 3 input channels here, if you like. There's 2 visual, 1 being you, the presenter, the second being the visual, because most people present with some sort of visual, and the audio channel being what you're listening to, me, the presenter, you, the presenter, talking. 2 visual, 1 audio. The message is, don't make this too busy. If this has too much information on it, or it's too busy, there's too much happening, if you're speaking too quickly and you're moving around too much, there's input overload. Okay? Next thing, what you say is only part of the message. This is pretty clear. What she's talking about here is non-verbal behaviour and the importance of the non-verbal message. We'll come back to that. Another thing she talks about is a call to action. Now, some public speakers require the audience to do something, whether it's giving at a charity event or something like that. In an academic situation or a conference situation, this might be, what do you want them to do or what do you want them to know? Okay? And I prefer to call this the takeaway message or the take-home message. When the audience leaves through the doors at the end of the session, what are they taking away with them? What have you said? And finally, people imitate your emotions. So even if you feel like you don't want to do this and you're dying inside, be positive. You've got to look positive, and the audience, according to Susan, tends to feed off your positivity or negativity. So make it a positive look. Okay, looking at then the organisation, if she's talking about sequencing or if we're talking about sequencing and structure, and clear structure, essentially any presentation, no matter what the length, has 3 parts. There's the introduction, where you tell them what you're going to tell them, the body, where you tell them, and the conclusion, where you tell them what you've just told them. It's a simple sort of 3-part structure. That introduction is essentially setting the context, telling them what you're going to say, so it could be a part 1, part 2, part 3 I'm going to talk about. Consider using a hook. Now, this doesn't always have to be something funny or a joke. It might be a relevant story, it could be a visual, it could be an interesting fact, it might be a question to the audience. Some sort of hook to engage the audience, engage the people you're talking to. 2, the body. Remember to split that into sections. Okay? Think about what you might present to the neutral listener, a reasonably intelligent but uninformed audience. Tell them the story, okay? So what is the logical sequence for it? And the conclusion should make clear, as well as the body should as well, is what the takeaway message is. So I always say, treat this like a narrative and tell the story logically. There are two types of language essentially you're using in your writing. It's the same when you're speaking in this sort of semi-formal situation. There's content language, that's what you're talking about, the topic, and there's functional language, which gives us, the listeners, the audience, signals about what you're saying. It might be things like sectioning. First I want to talk about, the next thing I want to move on to. It could be transitions, let me move on, or having said that, let me move on to the next point. It might be rephrasing or clarifying. Let me rephrase that. Let me point out that. These things give signals to the audience that something important is about to be said. Emphasis, summary, concluding, moving between sections, giving examples, all of that type of functional language is extremely important.